Everybody knows there's no better way to appear really smart than by dropping a perfectly timed quote from some famous literature. Not only does it show that you're really well read, but it also shows you're smart enough to memorize entire chunks of books, just in case that at some point you might need it. The problem is with these famous quotes that smart people occasionally drop into conversation is that without context, they're not really fully understood. And that means you might be using them without really understanding what they really mean, and that can mean you're saying something actually pretty dumb. And so, in today's video, we're going to be looking at the most misunderstood lines in literary history.
Number 10. Robert Frost, The Road Not Taken. The famous quote,
"I took the one less travelled by, and that has made all the difference."
The United States' most famous poet's most famous poem is a timeless ode to the American ideals of individuality and forging your own path. It's one of those poems that's so famous, even people who hate poetry can quote it. There are reasons it appears on the Academy of American Poets list of top poems for a college graduation. Except, aside from the last part, everything we said isn't true. Frost is actually using an old technique known as the unreliable narrator, and he isn't even being all that subtle about it. In spite of the famous quote's insistence that the one road is less travelled by, the second stanza of the poem clarifies that both roads are
Worn really about the same.
Oh, and also, Frost himself admitted that he was actually mocking the idea that single decisions would change your life, and specifically making fun of a friend of his who had a tendency to overthink things that really weren't that big of a deal. So what you thought was life-affirming was really just another poet hipster condescendingly saying, you think you're an individual when really you're just a cog in the machine, man. Number 9. William Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet. The famous quote,
"Star-crossed lovers."
Romeo and Juliet. Two teenagers in the throes of what could possibly be the most pure love in history. This is why when a magazine wants to comment on, say, Justin Bieber's love life, they're likely to reference the sonnet that opens Shakespeare's most famous play by calling them star-crossed lovers. And sure, this is totally appropriate if you're expecting these people to die. Star-crossed doesn't mean brought together by fate, it means fated to die, because the stars, fate, have crossed you. Shakespeare is intentionally reminding everyone at the beginning of his play that this is a freaking tragedy, you guys, and you're in for a miserable ride. Number 8. Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland. Famous quote,
"Oh, 'tis love that makes the world go round."
This is an amazingly misunderstood line from an amazingly misunderstood writer. Pretty much everything about the life of Lewis Carroll, real name Charles Dodgson, is shrouded in confusion and slander. Rather than being about drugs, Alice in Wonderland is most likely a criticism of then new forms of mathematics that were becoming popular at Dodgson's own Oxford College. In addition, though he was commonly accused of paedophilia, the annotated Alice and the Carroll myth makes the argument that Dodgson was actually asexual and preferred the company of children because he was extremely uncomfortable with courting and any form of sexual innuendo. Finally, and perhaps fittingly, his most famous quote is the one here about love making the world go round, and it is directly contrary to all of his pessimistic and strictly logical real-world values. In context, this quote is said by the Duchess, a character who is introduced as a potential child murderer. Hardly the kind of character a writer would want to speak the moral of his story. Finally, need we remind you that Dodgson was a mathematician? Almost every detail of his biography, as well as the actual context of this story, show that this idea of love as a geo-revolutionary repellent is supposed to be scoffed at, not adored. So it's true that you might believe this to be true, but if that's the case, it's also true that one of history's greatest writers is making fun of you. Number 7. William Shakespeare, Hamlet. The famous quote,
"This above all, to thine own self be true."
No, this is not the last time that Shakespeare is going to be appearing in this video. You can probably guess why this line has become popular. It is a simple platitude, and it's attractive because it deals with individuality, just like the Frost example previously. However, if you look at who's saying it and really analyze the content of the play, it becomes quickly obvious that Willie Shakes is making fun of this whole concept. As anyone who's read Shakespeare knows, the English language has evolved quite a bit since these plays were first performed, and what now seems like new-agey self-acceptance actually meant something quite different in Elizabethan times. Polonius is telling his son to work for himself and only for himself, and to put everyone else he encounters second. He's not encouraging individuality, he's encouraging selfishness. Furthermore, Polonius spends the whole play being a complete nitwit, and even Wikipedia's basic description of him includes pointing out that he is on the wrong side of all the judgments that he makes during the play. In most versions of the play, Laertes, Polonius' son, and the character he's talking to isn't even listening. Lots of stage directors will have the character roll his eyes and scamper off quickly to avoid the avalanche of cliches his father is dumping on him. So what sounds like the kind of cutesy nonsense you'd roll your eyes at is really just bad advice given by a dumb character to someone who isn't even listening. Number 6. John Keats' Ode to a Grecian Urn. The famous quote,
Beauty is truth. Truth, beauty.
Of all the examples on the list, this is probably the most likely to be misunderstood. After all, whether or not Keats was being serious when he said that beauty equals truth is basically the Kirk versus Picard of classic English literature. Unlike that controversy, there has actually emerged a begrudging consensus, and that is that Keats did not, in fact, believe that beauty is truth. The controversy boils down to whether Keats thought art was A, supposed to represent the real world, or B, was better than the real world, with most scholars eventually deciding that Keats believed the latter. Not only does this cast a strange shadow over the rest of Keats's work, which is described as being way over on the idealistic side of the sliding scale of idealism versus cynicism, but it's also just kind of funny and quirky that the most stereotypically pretentious comment in English literary history was actually a sarcastic quip. Number 5. William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. Famous quote,
Wherefore art thou, Romeo?
Wherefore means why, as in, why is your name Romeo? The central conflict of the play is that Romeo and Juliet can't be together because they are members of feuding families. Juliet isn't asking where Romeo is. That would be pretty stupid because he's standing right in front of her. Also, we told you Shakespeare would be on this list again. Number 4. Rudyard Kipling, The Ballad of East and West. Famous quote,
O east is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet.
It's usually just the last couple of lines here that are quoted, usually to describe two things that, won't ever meet. Memorable instances are from Raising Arizona,
There's what's right and there's what's right, and never the twain shall meet.
And the first episode of Secret Diary of a Call Girl, if anyone cares about that at all. The problem is that Kipling isn't just being sarcastic here, it's blatantly obvious that within the context of the poem, that it's just a straw man argument and only stated at all so he can immediately point out why the statement doesn't apply.
O east is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet, till earth and sky stand presently at God's great judgment seat. But there is neither east nor west, border nor breed nor birth, when two strong men stand face to face, though they come from the ends of the earth.
In addition to having some confusions about how capitalization works, silly 19th century, am I right? Kipling is taking the blatant stance that colonialism pretty much rules and East and West are going to meet pretty hard, despite all that physics stuff. Number 3. Robert Frost, Mending Wall. The famous quote,
Good fences make good neighbours.
Hey Robbie Frost, good to see you again on this list. Privacy is the theme this time, and while the phrase good fences make good neighbours is not quite so famous as some others, though you've certainly heard it, Mending Wall gets launched up to number 3 on this list for one simple reason. It's misunderstood by federal law.
Separation of powers, a distinctively American political doctrine, profits from the advice authored by a distinctively American poet. Good fences make good neighbours.
That's United States Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia literally creating hard law from thin air and not understanding the thing he's talking about. Mending Wall does contain the line, good fences make good neighbours, but it also paints the character speaking that line as a bit of a twit.
Something there is that doesn't love a wall. Nature sends the frozen groundswell under it.
The poem tells the story of two neighbours with a wall between them, but every winter the wall falls apart, so the neighbours have to meet and mend the wall, spending more time together than they otherwise would have, and growing increasingly frustrated with the other. Remember that the Supreme Court has 9 justices, and at least one actually pointed out the error in his concurring opinion, but Scalia decided to leave the mistake in anyway. Number 2. Friedrich Nietzsche, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Famous quote,
At the bottom of all these noble races, the beast of prey, the splendid blonde beast, prowling about avidly in search of spoil and victory.
I'm not going to read the whole quote here because Nietzsche was a philosopher and pretty long-winded. but I've read the important parts. Or rather, I've read the parts that the Nazis thought were important when they were all Naziing around and committing the first ever industrialized genocide, trying to live up to the standards that Nietzsche apparently set forth for them. The problem is that that's not what Nietzsche meant at all. The original quote ends like this:
"The Roman, Arabian, Germanic, Japanese nobility, the Homeric heroes, the Scandinavian Vikings, they all shared this need."
Everyone's a blonde beast because blonde beasts are a metaphor for lions. So if you're going to use a philosopher as the backbone of your political movement, you might want to make sure you finish reading his sentence before you get the war machine up and running. Also, the fact that you thought that he was advocating genocide was probably a pretty good hint that you shouldn't have been listening to him anyway. Stupid Nazis. Number 1. William Shakespeare, Sonnet 18. Famous quote:
"Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?"
This is definitely the most quoted line in all of English literature, so much so that you've probably seen it as a parody more than you've seen it written out straight. For example, "Shall I compare thee to a bale of hay?" It's one of the few poems that is just so cliché that if a guy recited it to his girlfriend on a date, even the most lovesick of recipients would roll their eyes in disgust. But when Shakespeare thinks about love, he's not talking about romantic love or feminine beauty. The first 126 sonnets in Shakespeare's work are generally understood to be addressed towards a man, and many of the surrounding pieces are actually encouraging procreation. Shakespeare isn't wooing a beautiful woman, he's telling a wealthy young Pons exactly what he wants to hear, that he's just so damn sexy that it'd be pretty much the worst thing in the world if he didn't have kids. So if you're a lady watching this and any guy offers to compare you to a summer's day, say no, because I'm not a dude. If you're a guy, don't offer to compare your lady to a summer's day. If you're a man whose wife is trying to convince you that it's time to have kids, then, actually, this is pretty fine. Nicely done. So I really hope you enjoyed that video, and I'd love to know what you think of it, so please leave a comment below. I'm also going to link over to another video that you might enjoy, so just click on that thumbnail on the screen now, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel because we put out a new video 7 days a week, and you can also visit us online. Just go to TopTenzNet. Thanks for watching.